Tonight, the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, under fire on several fronts and fighting off calls for his resignation. He broke his silence today and agreed to an interview with our Justice correspondent, Pete Williams.
After enduring weeks of criticism over the government's aggressive investigation of leaks, the Attorney General says a better balance must be struck between press freedom and safeguarding national secrets.
I'm a little concerned that things have gotten a little out of whack. I think we can do a better job than we have. We can reform those regulations, reform those guidelines to better reflect that balance. I'm a little concerned that things have gotten a little out of whack. I think we can do a better job than we have. We can reform those regulations, reform those guidelines to better reflect that balance. I'm a little concerned that things have gotten a little out of whack. I think we can do a better job than we have. We can reform those regulations, reform those guidelines to better reflect that. A little concerned that things have gotten a little out of whack. I'm a little concerned that things have gotten a little out of whack. I think we can do a better job than we have. We can reform those regulations, reform those guidelines to better reflect that balance. Whack. I think we can do a better job than we have. We can reform those regulations, reform those guidelines to better reflect that balance.
Benghazi happened a long time ago.
You know, as Mr. Issa has said, lying to Congress is a federal felony. You know, I don't want to say that you have committed a felony, Mr. Attorney General, but obviously there have been statements so misleading that a letter had to be withdrawn. I think that some heads should roll, and I do agree with Senator Grassley that Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, Lanny Breuer, should be fired. And I know that that decision is not yours, but it is the President's. But I think that merely getting the head of the ATF director at the time is not sufficient, since it's obvious that there was knowledge within the Justice Department. What are you going to do to clean up this mess?
Well, first let me make something very clear, and in response to an assertion that you made or hinted at, nobody in the Justice Department has lied.
Why was the letter withdrawn?
The letter was withdrawn because there's information in there that was inaccurate. The Justice Department letter of February...
Okay, well, tell me what's the difference between lying and misleading Congress in this context?
Well, if you want to have this legal conversation, it all has to do with your state of mind and whether or not you had the requisite intent to come up with something that can be considered perjury or a lie. The information that was provided in that February 4th letter was gleaned by the people who drafted the letter after they interacted with people who they thought were in the best position to have the information.
Okay.
Do you agree that on February the 4th, the letter that was written to Senator Grassley that with the allegation that ATF sanctioned or otherwise knowingly allowed the sale of assault weapons to a straw purchaser who then transported them into Mexico is false? That letter, dated February the 4th, 2011, is itself false. We now know.
I'd say what I said is it contains inaccurate information.
Well, isn't that false?
Well, false, I don't want to quibble with you, but false, I think, implies people making a decision to deceive, and that was not what was going on there. People were in good faith giving what they thought was correct information to Senator Grassley. We now know that that information was not correct.
Okay, if you won't agree with me, it was false, it's not true. You agree with that, right?
I'd say it's not accurate.
It's not accurate.
Mm-hmm.
2011, why would he let a letter that was false represent the position of the Department of Justice?
Well, first off, the briefing, the blue one, AAG Brewer brief, that was about wide receiver. That wasn't about Fast and Furious.
By the way, do you know the differences between wide receiver and Fast and Furious?
I mean, do I know that they're different operations?
Right. And so do you know the differences, the factual differences between wide receiver and Fast and Furious?
I know that, well, I mean, there are a number of differences, both, I think, in scope, both in terms of time. The Bush administration was the one that started wide receiver. The Obama administration is where Fast and Furious began.
Are you winging this, or do you actually know?
I know this.
Do you know that wide receiver was done in conjunction with the government of Mexico, and the intention but the plan was to follow the weapons, and neither was there the intention to follow the weapons on Fast and Furious, nor did Mexico know that the United States government was allowing guns to walk into the hands of the cartels. Did you know that?
Senator, I have not tried to equate the two. I've not tried to equate wide receiver with Fast and Furious.
I'm just asking you if you know the differences between the two.
Sure, and as what I know about wide receiver, what you have said is in fact correct. There are memos that talk about gun walking that are related to wide receiver, but again, I'm not trying to equate the two. No.
Can you name me one person who's been held accountable for this Fast and Furious operation? Just one in the Department of Justice.
Well, we have...
General Eric Holder is the first cabinet member ever to be held in contempt of Congress. General Eric Holder is the first cabinet member ever to be held in contempt of Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a sad day, Mr. Speaker, for those of us who respect the rule of law as the foundation of this republic, for those of us who proudly work for the Department of Justice, for those of us who believe the same rules apply to everyone, regardless of whether they live simple lives of peace and quiet or whether they live and work in the towers of power, prestige, and authority. The same rules apply to everyone. The chief law enforcement official for this country is on the eve of being held in contempt of Congress because he refuses to follow the law. He refuses to allow Congress to find the truth, the whole truth. My question to you is simply this. Will you settle for 75% of the truth? Is 50% of the truth enough for you? Is a third? Or do you want it all? Because if you want all the truth, then you want all the documents. And I will not compromise, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to finding the truth. Congress is right to pursue this no matter where it takes us. No matter which administration was in power, and no matter what the facts are, we are right to pursue this. And we are wrong if we settle for anything less than all the facts. To my colleagues who are voting no, Mr. Speaker, let me ask this. Can you tell me, can you tell the American people why the Department of Justice approved this lethal, fatally flawed operation? To those of you who are voting no, can you tell the American people how the tactic of gun walking was sanctioned? To those of you who are voting no, can you tell Brian Terry's family and friends how a demonstrably false letter was written on Department of Justice letterhead on February the 4th, and where would we be if we accepted that letter at face value? A letter written on Department of Justice letterhead. That is not just another political cabinet agency. It is emblematic of what we stand for as a country: truth, justice, the equal application of law to everyone. That letter was written on America stationery. That is what the Department of Justice is, and it was dead wrong. And where would we be if we took their word for it? Our fellow citizens have a right to know the truth, and we have an obligation to fight for it, Mr. Speaker. The politics be damned. We have a right to fight for it. I wish the Attorney General would give us the documents.
Executive privilege is defined in the leading Supreme Court case, interestingly, United States versus Nixon. That's Richard Nixon. That's the Watergate era. That's the efforts of the special prosecutor to subpoena tapes from President Nixon as protecting conversations with the president himself. Now, the letter that Eric Holder wrote to the president saying, please give me executive privilege, does not say, because I discussed this with you, Mr. President, but the implication is there. Executive privilege protects communications with the president, the human being of the president, not with people that work for him and the Justice Department.
So let's be clear now. You say this is not an acceptable subject for executive privilege.
Correct. Unless
then why would they seek this?
There must be something in these documents, or there must be someone who observed these documents that the Attorney General is trying to keep from public view. If the Attorney General sat down and discussed it with the President, he probably doesn't want the Congress and the public to know that, because we know of the awful events that occurred as a result of the Fast and Furious escapade. But we also know that executive privilege only pertains to military, diplomatic, and sensitive national security matters. Now, Was fighting the drug gangs at the border a sensitive national security matter? And if so, was the President of the United States of America personally involved in making decisions as to how to conduct that fight? If that's the case, this has reached a different level, and we now know why the Attorney General has ferociously defended these documents.
If the Attorney General had a conversation about this ATF operation in Phoenix, Arizona with the President of the United States, perhaps executive privilege applies here. But what would the President of the United States have to do with this operation run by the ATF allegedly out of Phoenix?
Well, I could only speculate. I have no basis for this, but the President of the United States may have wanted to participate in decisions about defending the border between Mexico and Texas, Mexico and New Mexico, Mexico and Arizona, and they may have run this past the President. But, Bill, if the President of the United States knew about this, if Attorney General Holder discussed this with President Obama, that would be at odds with his testimony under oath given to Congressman Iss's committee, and then he'd be in a lot of hot water.
David Schweiker, Congressman from Arizona, was with Martha just a few moments ago.
Right.
He said, makes you wonder what they don't want us to see.
Congressman Schweiker is correct. It does make you wonder what they don't want us to see. They can't have it both ways. If the President was not personally involved, executive privilege doesn't apply. If the President was personally involved and they want to argue that, that fighting drug gangs at the border is a matter of sensitive national security, then they at least have an argument for executive privilege, but that would be at odds with what Attorney General Holder has already testified to under oath.
Later, at the Hall of Justice.
And the government obtained phone and email records of Fox News reporter James Rosen to investigate the leak of sensitive intelligence about North Korea, calling him in court documents at the very least an aider or abettor or co-conspirator. Holder says that phrase was required by law to get a search warrant.
I don't like that because it means that me as a government official who has great respect for the press is in essence saying that a reporter who is doing his or her job and doing that very important job is somehow branded a criminal, and I'm just not comfortable with that. We're going to change that. I don't like that because it means that me as a government official who has great respect for the press is in essence saying that a reporter who is doing his or her job and doing that very important job is somehow branded a criminal, and I'm just not comfortable with it. I don't like that because it means that me as a government official who has great respect for the press is in essence saying that a reporter who is doing his or her job and doing that very important job is somehow branded a criminal, and I'm just not comfortable with it.
The AP story, the government seizing phone records, cell records, home telephone records of reporters, is a profound and direct assault on the First Amendment. This administration, like everybody who works for the government, like you and I when we became lawyers, took an oath to uphold the Constitution, which includes the First Amendment. There's only three ways they can get these records. They can have a grand jury subpoena them, in which case the subpoenaing entity, the U.S. attorney who presents the case to the grand jury, has to tell the person, we are going for your records. They're not in your custody.
Hello, AP?
Correct.
We're going to go get your phone records.
These records are in the custody of Verizon or whoever it may be, so we're not worried about you destroying them, but you have a right to challenge the subpoena.
They didn't do it.
Correct. Or they can go to a judge, present evidence of probable cause of crime, and get a search warrant, in which case they don't have to tell the AP. They just show up at Verizon's office or whoever the carrier is and get the phone records.
There's an exception, though, to having to tell them when national security would be at risk at telling them.
Yes.
They claim that this was the case. Even though the AP was reporting on something that had happened months and months and months earlier, they claimed if they told the AP they were doing this, national security would be at risk.
Here's why they can't have it both ways, because the third way that they can get these records is a national security letter. Basically, a federal agent writes a search warrant authorizing another federal agent to get the documents under the Patriot Act. In my view, and in view of many who observe this, and at least 6 federal judges, this is unconstitutional, but it is the law. When they do that, they have to certify that it is a matter of national security and they are investigating terrorism. They already told us this is a plain, old-fashioned crime of leaking.